All right, if we go back to one of our early lectures, we said that one of the most important dates of the 17th century was 1624. And you may recall that that is the year in which Edward Herbert wrote or published the book De Veritate, which is Latin for concerning the truth. As we said in a previous lecture, he denied the a priori. Remember, a priori, beforehand. Definition of what it means to be human. Which was derived from systematic theology and scripture. Does that sound like anyone we've talked about so far this semester? It's a variation on someone else's thought. Anyone want to guess? Remember, Giordano Bruno said, science is not the handmaiden of theology. Theology is not the queen of the sciences. We know the world through science, and science will judge the truth of theology. What Herbert is talking about is very similar to what Bruno said. We're not going to start with the definition of what it means to be human and then interpret human behavior in terms of that definition. Instead, we need to look at the world. Because when we look at the world, we will perceive that the world is ordered and structured. And the only conclusion that we can reach from that is that God exists. Everything that we know, everything we need to know about God can be derived from the world. That becomes a key point. You may also remember from an earlier lecture that we said this led to deism and to natural theology. Both of which more or less came to an end in the early 19th century. All right, are there any questions before I move on? Again, most of this is review. Everybody okay?
Yeah, we're good. Thank you.
Okay. So, Herbert didn't realize that this created an important question. If this is true, then how do we know what it means to be human? And how do we make moral decisions? Because if you start out with the definition of the good, hell, it's really easy to figure out what's moral. But there is no a priori definition of human here or of the good. So this triggered a lot of debate. And finally, between 1725 and 1731, two men who were writing at about the same time attempted to answer especially that question. The conclusion that they came to, well, let me show you their question first. They posed the question this way: how do we achieve the greatest good for the greatest number? Okay. Their definition of the greatest good came directly from, no surprise, Aristotle. And we're momentarily going to look at what Aristotle said. But the net of what Aristotle said was that all humans long to be happy. Now, as we go on to the next point, keep in mind that what Aristotle meant by happy is not what we mean by happy. What Aristotle meant by happy is not what we mean by happy. Okay, so once again, another 175 years later, around 1800, an Englishman by the name of Jeremy Bentham changes this question so that it now becomes the greatest pleasure for the greatest number. Once again, what Bentham meant by pleasure is not what we mean by pleasure. For Bentham, it was similar to Aristotle's concept of happiness, and it was supposed to be intellectual. This, by the way, is the beginning of a school of thought called Utilitarianism. In many ways, it will reach its peak with John Stuart Mill. Bentham's pleasure becomes the principle of harm. And the principle of harm says, I have complete and total autonomy as long as I don't harm you. And the only purpose of society is provide redress. Redress is fixing a harm. If you crash into my car, redress is you fix my car. All right. Are there any questions so far?
This might seem like a really silly anecdote, but when people say like do whatever makes you happy as long as it doesn't hurt others, is that a remnant of that, or is that just something that we just said?
Absolutely.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. Now let me be clear. Because we have lost the principle of redress, our society's breaking down. I just finished an essay that I'll be publishing about reforming healthcare. And what it comes down to is that whether you're on the far left or on the far right, the only difference between the two of you is your ideology. Because both the far left and the right are endorsing radical autonomy. The right says, you can't tell me to wear a mask. You can't tell me to vaccinate. You can't tell me not to own a gun. You can't tell me anything. The left says, my body, my choice. If I don't like what you say, if you upset me, I'm going to ghost you. I'm going to cancel you. I'm going to pick my gender. I'm going to pick my sexuality. Anything that comes from outside me is grossly oppressive. It's the same radical autonomy, only the ideology is different. And this is in part, as we said in a previous lecture, because in 1932, the Humanist Manifesto failed to offer a counter proposal to John Stuart Mill. In the same year, the World Council of Churches was formed, and it failed to respond to John Stuart Mill. So from 1932 to 1960, all the major Christian churches are going into a period of decline from which they've never really recovered. The result of this, in 1963, Joseph Fletcher is situational ethics. In situational ethics, neither intention or consequence matter. And the only ethical question is, what is the loving thing to do in this moment. Think about what people say. In contemporary moral problems, I will say, you're late for a job interview. It's an incredibly important interview. So you cut through a residential neighborhood, you're speeding, and you hit and kill a child. Are you guilty of manslaughter? And every single time I give that example, my students will say no. And when I ask them why, the answer is because I didn't intend to do it. Are you beginning to see why we have become morally bankrupt? Yes, no?
Yes.
Are you saying by that point that even if there wasn't an intention, that it's still manslaughter?
Yeah,
Okay.
it is. Yeah. And if you refuse to be vaccinated and you get COVID and you give it to someone, that's reckless endangerment. And if they die, it's manslaughter. Let me finish this and we'll come back to one more point pertaining to that. So how do we know what to do in the moment? Well, Fletcher said it's really very simple. There are two types of love. That agape is a dispassionate spiritual love that's based on the golden rule, whereas eros is selfish, self-centered, and focuses on self-satisfaction. Situational ethics didn't work. So by the mid-1960s, just do it. Don't think about it. Don't think about the consequences. Don't think about your intentions. Focus on the moment, and whatever it is you decide you're going to do it. You see, part of the problem that is inherent in both the radical left and the radical right is that Mill forgot one thing. All actions have social consequences. We do not exist alone. And by the way, lest you misunderstand, I am not pro-life and I am not pro-choice. I think abortion will continue to be one of the great moral issues that we will face for generations to come. For me, the fact that it has a complete set of unique DNA is deeply problematic. It is not the same as a tumor. It is not the same as a hangnail. I don't know whether it's human or not, but it has a complete set of unique human DNA. Until we figure out what this means, we're not going to solve the abortion problem. Am I clear? Yes,
Yeah.
no?
Yes.
Well,
Okay.
I guess I wonder, is the issue whether or not, if it's a person or not? I feel like people argue that even if it is a person, it's still the right to decide, right? Or no?
Well, they do, but here's the problem. I don't want to go too far down this road because it can take us off topic, but the question of being a person ultimately comes down to a very vague concept called viability. And viability is very loosely defined as so I'm the caretaker of the mother of my children. She has dementia. When she reaches the point where she's not able to be autonomous, and we're not far away from that, does she cease to be a person? Does she cease to be viable? Can I make a decision to terminate her? We don't know. We don't know. Until we begin to answer these questions, we're not going to solve the dilemma posed by abortion. I do think that John Stuart Mill was wrong. It's not simply a question of whether you harm me or I harm you. All actions have social consequences. And again, I don't know what that means for issues like euthanasia, abortion, assisted suicide. I don't know. Wish I did, but I don't know. All right. Any other questions so far? Is this helpful? Everybody good? All right. I'm going to plug in my laptop while you're thinking. All right. Let's look at Aristotle specifically if you don't have any other questions. And let's talk about what Aristotle actually meant and said. And then we're going to look at Alistair MacIntyre. All right, everybody okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Let's go back and talk about Aristotle. The concept that is most important is arete. Arete means excellence. The key to understanding Aristotle's concept of morality is the concept of excellence. It's coupled with the concept of nothing in extreme. So while someone like Thomas Aquinas in the 12th century would say, avoid all physical pleasure, Aristotle is saying, you want to drink that beer? Have at it. Just don't drink enough beer that you get drunk. Excellence pertains specifically to your function in society. If you are a blacksmith, be the best at what you are. And part of excellence, part of being the best, is the cultivation of proper habit. What does it mean to be the best blacksmith? How do you practice blacksmithing so that you become the best? Now, the next point is really critically important. The word is nomos. That is Greek, and it has two definitions. The wall of the city and law. For Aristotle, there is no humanity outside the city. There is no humanity without law. And more importantly, the individual is always defined in a social context. I exist in relationship to all other citizens. So if we think about it, if this is a very badly drawn picture of the walls of the city, then all the individuals exist within the context of the city. And there is no humanity apart from the city and apart from law. To be free is to be free within limitations. Specifically within the limitations of the law. Okay, let's see, Joshua, how would you contrast that to John Stuart Mill?
It seems to fly in the face of the principle of harm, where I would imagine that Mill would say that being subject to the law was harming him, or it could harm him in some cases. So therefore, it's not correct, or it's not the moral thing to do.
That's right. Kaiba, anything you want to add to that? Kaiba Humphreys?
No.